Terrific. Thank you so much. Very happy to have the opportunity to talk to you. This is a topic that I've been trying to get to for a long time. And because I'm busy with all sorts of different things, I never really sat down and had like a narrative of what is it that I want to say. So together with you, we'll try and kind of make sense of how to think about replications. I think generally as a community, we're very confused. We think that we've made some advancements in the last decade, especially in social psychology, maybe less so in the business side. But I think even though we're on the right track and we're doing a lot more in that, I think there's a lot of things that we haven't really debated. We haven't really opened up. And few groups in different places and the Twitter sphere are trying to open up some questions for debates. And I was kind of looking for an opportunity to share a little bit of what is it that our perspective is as a group mostly made of early career researchers and students with a vast experience in replications, how we view what we think should be happening with replications. And I'm going to try and share a little bit of the case studies with you. In the chat, I shared the slides. The slides are downloadable, so you can scan the QR code or you can take this. There's some hidden slides. There are lots of links where you can just like click on those and get some more information. And these are preliminary slides, so I did all this in a bit of a rush, and afterwards perhaps I'll update this in future talks. So I'm really pre-testing this together with you. And I'm hoping that I think we have an hour and a half, so like 45 minutes or so, up to an hour. I'll share a little bit of what my perspective is. I'll try and get some of your perspectives in a Mentimeter kind of survey to see where you're at with this. And then we can have an open discussion on this. And I'm really hoping that aside from perhaps questions that you might have for me, I'm curious to hear what your perspective is on this, because this is all very much work in progress and thoughts that I'm having rather than this is my conclusion, these are my conclusions, this is what I think should be happening. I just want to say that all the talks that I give since the pandemic started, that's one of the very few upsides of this pandemic is that it forced me to record everything. And then I realized that there's a power in sharing not only our research, the data materials, the code, but also in how we talk about things, and then maybe getting a larger community to do all this. So in the spirit of open science, also the talks are available, and hopefully this as well will be added if you want to go back and revisit or share this with others or start a conversation about these topics. I'm very quick background. Perhaps some of you are aware of some of the things that we do, but I'm also going to use this background as a recruitment method. So, if you are an early career researcher or you're a student, we really want to work with you, or we want to help you do more open science or care more about replications. So I just want to show you what's available for you if you decide that aside from what you're doing in your studies, PhD, or early career, you want to do more with others in the community. So we have a team. It's been growing rather fast with all kinds of places around the world, people coming from all stages, starting from second year undergraduates in my classes at the University of Hong Kong, up to, I think, associate professors. We have a few, but most of them are early career researchers working together in order to try and do as many replications as possible in a very specific domain that I care about, judgment and decision making and social psychology / social cognition, trying to map out what's going on in our field. You can see that we have different kinds of roles. We have lead authors. So each one of the projects that I completed with the students in my courses, you are invited to come in and take the lead first author in helping us bring this to publication. And then you're shared first co-author in a note with the students, followed by the teaching assistants, and then we work together to submit this. We also, almost everything that I do, I'm very active on Twitter. So I go on Twitter and say, the students have done this, or the early career researcher has done this. This is what we've done in a preprint. Who wants to help us do better? So we've recruited also quite a few peer reviewers, also from Norway and people here. So it's nice to see how everything comes together. And then peer reviewers, if they want, they can just stay as peer reviewers. If they want, they can become co-authors or more active, or they can become lead authors. But together, you can see that it's a growing team that is starting to have a real impact, because after 4 years, we've completed about 120 of those, 80 with data collection completed, manuscript written, and on the way or submitted to a journal. And at the beginning, I wasn't even sure that we'll be able to get any replications into journals. But until now, especially in the last 2 years, 25 already of those, and there's 10 in the process, and it's looking pretty positive. But in the last year and a half, I've been trying to shift this from completing everything with data collection to moving to register reports. So this year, everything that I do with thesis students, both undergraduates and master students, we're doing as peer community in register reports, which is very ambitious, meaning that all the theses are register reports and are supposed to be in principally accepted and finally appear in one of the open science community journals that are interested in this. But you can see 120 in 4 years. This is quite a large undertaking, and I wouldn't be able to do any of this if it wasn't for this special structure where on one side I work with the students in the courses, and on the other side I have people like you who come and join us and take the lead on these projects. And never imagined that we'll be able to get into these kinds of journals. But as you can see in our publications, the first author is usually an early career researcher like yourself, followed by the students who are underlined, then teaching assistants, and then me at the back. And we've been able to get this in all kinds of journals that I've never imagined, like in the Journal of Economic Psychology, so economics related. Social psychology, some of them are pretty prominent, and it's nice because it's like increasing impact and more collaborators, and I think they are building their knowledge on how to conduct replications. So if this is something that appeals to you, we are very interested in working with you. And here you can see that with every one of the students working with me this year, we're doing peer community and register reports. And everything is open, so you can go and look at the preprints and the open science framework. So if any of these topics are interesting to you, let us know, and we can talk about how to collaborate on this. But really, scaling up from in my PhD, I did my PhD in management, not in social psychology. So I grew up in a business school, doing maybe 1 or 2 projects a year, to now the power of community, bridging a lot of people together and trying to build an impact in the field. If you're interested in this, there's a very long Google Doc that you can go and visit. You can click on this. You can do a lot of things. You can take over our completed replications. You can do a register report, or you can join many of our guides. So we have guides on effect size, confidence intervals, power analysis, how to do a replication, how to do an extension. And if you contribute, you become a collaborator. So my website has this link. This includes everything about our team. So that hopefully concludes our introduction of the team. So if you want to know more, what we've been doing, everything that we've produced in the last 4 years, you can go on that link and check this. This is all to say that I've been doing a lot of replications. So I've spent 4 years thinking about replications from every possible angle. And if it might seem like, okay, you have a team, so you work together, you submit, everything works very smoothly. But if you followed some of my journey on Twitter, I share both the success and the frustrations, and gosh, so many frustrations. So I've learned so much about the publishing world, the system, about how we do science. And I have to say, it's been a very, very difficult journey. As an early career researcher myself, in my postdoc, I was very worried about what are the implications of me deciding to invest in this. Because obviously, I think both in our hiring and in our promotion practices, we emphasize novel research, groundbreaking, counterintuitive, p-value needs to be lower than 0.05, rather than replications. null findings, these kinds of things. Where is your real contribution? So this is, until now, every year when I have evaluations in the University of Hong Kong, they've been very supportive of things that I want to do, perhaps as education-related training sort of thing. But in terms of research, there's expectations that I follow the mainstream and do more of the high-impact things that will get me into the top-tier journals. And I've decided that I don't want to do that. I really care about this. And I've experienced a lot of frustrations. And I'll share some of those together with you. And it's important that we learn not only from the success of what we've been able to bring to publications or do as a team, but also a lot from the process of how we're learning what is it that's happening. So we're moving a little bit from lower level replications, open science into a meta science level, where we've had so many rejection letters, and we've started coding those. So we've started coding is like, why are they rejecting us? What kind of reasons are they bringing in? If I push back on those and I try to explain to both the reviewers and the editor and give them evidence whether this is, unfounded, or there's, perhaps they're wrong about this, does this help? Is it easy to change the mind? Is there something that's happening in this journal but not in this journal? Are journals improving over time? So important to sometimes take a step back from all the fine details of the replications and then look at 120. So now we've had 120. We have so many submissions, so many rejections, so many acceptances. Now we can try and make sense of this. So I don't have insights based on evidence on meta science level. We're working on this. So many of the things that I share with you today are based on my intuitions being kind of like in the center coordinating these kinds of things. So it would be nice to have evidence, but I think starting off just like discussing these things. So what have we learned? Before I share this with you, I want to know a little bit what you think. So if it's okay with you guys, I'm gonna open a Mentimeter. Let me just see where it is. Yeah, it's over here. And I'll ask for your opinion. So basically what this means is that you go on a link. I'll try and shift the share to a different screen. This screen. Can you see this? So if you go on menti.com and you enter this code 17643647, then I'm giving you some questions. And the first question that I have for you is, in an ideal world, what percentage of all articles should be replications? I'll tell you what the number is right now in a few minutes, but ideally, at the end, when we have the most unbelievable accurate science, what percentage of all articles that we publish, whatever journals, should be replications? First, I'm asking you what is considered top-tier empirical journal. I don't know what you think about that. What is top tier? And then the second one is like an average tier empirical journal. Let me see, did I skip one? No, I didn't skip. Okay, so we have this as the first question for you. See if you have any opinion to share with me on this. Okay, good. Okay, I'll move to the next one. I'll come back to this. Next question is, in the following journals, and this is a very specific journal, I was going to do a list, but we don't have a lot of time. I'll focus on one journal, and this is the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. I would say both in the business schools, in the good business schools that care about psychology, and in social psychology, JSP, Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, is definitely considered to be an A. So a leader in our community, cares a little bit more about open science. So what do you think the percentage is for replication out of, in the percentage of published articles in JSP that are replications, and the percentages of the submissions to JSP that are replications? So just asking you, what do you think that the ratio is at the moment? And I'll keep this hidden for a second, and then I'll move on to the final one. My question to you is, how do you think we're doing on replications? I think the last decade, open science, science reform movement, we've understood that we need a little bit more of that. The question is, are we doing okay with replications? Do we need more? Do we need less? So So obviously we're in the reproducibility club, so we have a certain bias towards a direction, but I am curious to see where you are with this. So if we'll go back to the first one, we have 7. So what we can see over here is that in an ideal world, a third perhaps of top tier journal publications should be replications. The question is really why a third? So still what this basically means is that novel research has a 2-to-1 kind of advantage over replication. So that basically means that for every one of the novel findings that will have a replication, we'll also have a novel finding that does not have a replication. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. Is it enough for just like one lab to do one, let's say, well-powered register report? Is that enough for us to establish a phenomena or not? Is it okay for us to leave a novel finding without a replication? Slightly higher rates for an average tier empirical journal. I don't think this is significant differences, but let's just say that perhaps we value replications differently based on top tier. And for some reason, I think we expect top tier to have less replications or more focus on novel research. And we need to kind of consider why do we feel that way? Like, what is it that differentiates top tier? And I'm going to give you a kind of a teaser that my definition of top tier is more aligned with the top guidelines rather than impact factor. So for me, meta-psychology is top tier journal. Like for me, this is my aim. I love this kind of journal. I think transparency and openness are the most important thing. So I emphasize that. And I think a very important thing that should be in a top tier journal is emphasis on rigor, evidence, and the need to take responsibility and publish replications, not only for things in your own journal, but in general, as long as the replications are, of course, conducted well, rigorous, and all of that. So that's already interesting for me to see kind of where you're at with this, especially, since coming. So I consider reproducibility to be a very open science-oriented kind of group. So if these are our estimates for an open science group, you can imagine what the estimates are for ones that are not so supportive of open science. If we move a little bit further, so JSP, what are the, what do you think the percentages for the replications? So 10% perhaps of JSP publications are replications. I really wish this was the case, not even close. How many of the submissions to JSP are replications? 33%. Okay, I'll show you where we're at with this. Coming up soon. Next one. Okay, so I like it that in reproducibility we're very open science oriented, and we all think that we need more replications. I completely agree with you on this. This is kind of like the point of the whole discussion here. So I'm gonna share back my slides. Yeah. Okay. So we're back here. Now we have some basic intuitions. You thought a little bit about this. Now you're understanding perhaps the complexity of what's going on. And major issue, I'm going to start with this. The bottom line is we just don't do replications. And we have such a strong bias against doing replications, against submitting. Let's say that you even did a replication. Do you submit this to a journal? Do you want to go through the whole process of trying to bring this to publication in a system that really does not want to publish replications? Even the most open science supportive journals. This is a slide that I took from Chris Chambers, who I think took this from Monalfo. I use this a lot to kind of incentivize register reports, but I want to start from one finding that I always included from the slides because other people put this here, and it's this one over here. So Chris Chambers, Marcus Monalfo, and others always bring this as the site for how many replications are we doing? 1 in 1,000. Based on 2012. And for the first time for this talk, I kind of went to look at what it is that they're doing. I was really curious about this. I don't know exactly where the 1 in 1,000 is, but you can see that, just like trying to, so they did a randomized selection from a journal and trying to code, is it a replication? Are they really doing a replication? What kind of keywords are they looking for? Is this a direct or is this a conceptual one? So from the analysis, you can see the replication rates are kind of like increasing a little bit to some extent, but basically they're getting to a real replication rate of maybe 2% at best. And this is after a very specific criteria has been established and within the top 100 psychology journals. And this is including what is considered to be like conceptual replications that are closer, but not entirely direct replications. Of course, I'm not even talking about, power and pre-registrations, definitely not registered reports, because this is 2012, 1 year before this was. So just consider for a second what this graph means over here. And as I was reading this, relating to our discussion over here, what merits replication? I thought this was a really good quote, because nevertheless, as a field, we need to decide what is good enough for replication rates. And I don't think that since 2012, I was going through the cited by all the people who cited this paper, has anyone discussed what is a good replication rate? Like in a journal, is it 33 for a top tier journal? Like, why is it 33? How many do we need? We haven't decided this. We haven't even discussed this. We've talked a lot about replications, but not the replication rates at which we should be publishing or submitting these kinds of things. And what is the criteria? They had all sorts of thoughts, but they didn't really know. So they said, in arbitrary selection, if a publication is cited 100 times, we think it would be strange if no attempt at replication has been conducted and published. Do you know how many papers there are with more than 100 citations that don't have replications? I would just like, based on my intuition and some of the citations that I read, I would say 95 to 99% of papers with more than 100 citations have never been replicated, which is an opportunity for us, if we want to do more replications, to kind of go back and add some value to it. And they mentioned this is, if it's 100 citations, then that means that as a community, we decided that this is impactful. We decided that this matters. We decided that we care about these findings. And I'm going to come back to this when I'm going to talk about the need to replicate unpublished findings, because there are some preprints out there that have been cited more than 100 times, but have never, the thing has never been published. So nobody refers to this as a solid finding other than citing it. But as a community, we've decided that this is important. But because based on some criteria from, I don't know, decades ago, it wasn't published, then as a community, we just don't think this is important to be replicated. But I like this, at least as a baseline, to think of 100 times cited means that we as a community care about this. And almost all of the replications that we've conducted, 120, have 100 to 5,000, 6,000 citations. So we definitely try and focus on the ones that we think the community has already decided that needs to be published. So this is a good starting point. Now, let's take a little bit of data. I don't have official publications, but I am very active on Twitter and I follow some of the editors. And one of them is the JSP editor, Roger. And Roger is definitely among the editors, very open science. He goes to the Society for Improvement of Psychological Science. He has reformed the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology in ways that no one has ever imagined a decade ago. He has done a lot into promoting this sort of thing. In his editorial, he has some things that he thinks, promoting replications, pre-registrations, one of the first to adopt register reports in social psychology. So JSP is considered to be a leader, even though it's a for-profit publisher. At least the people who are involved within our community seem to be open science folks. What are the rates? And you'll see a lot of my screen captures from Twitter. So, and if you want to go and check this out, you have the links over here. What does Roger say about JSP? So in 2019, JSP received roughly 617 manuscripts. Of these, 12 had something related to replications in the title, which is a fairly good proxy for. So this is 1.7%. When it comes to publication, we've started to code Journal of Experimental Social Psychology to see what's happening. It's much worse. So we're talking about submissions. We're not talking about publications. And the funny thing is that out of the 12 submissions that they had in 2019, 6 were our team. So only of all the other people in the world, only 6 teams submitted replications to JSP. This is how bad things are in one of our leading top open science supportive journals in social psychology. Journal of Personality in Social Psychology is considered to be perhaps even like an A+. Everybody aims to publish over there. What are the rates over? So Katie gave some very rough stats on this. Of those 462 papers, 12 were replications published under the new policy with the, they have this track. They're changing. So 2 months ago, they've announced they have a new editorial, then they're changing, they're doing registry reports, not only for applications, for other things. But 2 of our lead journals, 2%, 2.5%, these are submissions. Now, how are we doing in 2020? Have we improved as a community? So I was very surprised to see him reflecting SPSP in a video. How are we doing? In JSP, we rarely get more than 10 replications a year out of 700. And it's called Time for Change, reflections on how we do replications. And the question that I have, and I followed up on this, are we really rewarding replication work? Now, I just want to say that JSP has been a very frustrating journal for me, to the point that I almost decided this year I'm not submitting to JSP anymore unless the target of the replication was originally published in JSP. And the reasons for that is that the editors in Journal of Experimental Social Psychology are not aligned with Roger. So Roger is the chief editor over there. He says the editorials, but then the editors do whatever it is that they want, completely regardless of what Roger is setting as a kind of a policy or ideology. And because they don't inform one another on what they're doing, and Roger does not know what his editors are doing, we get a lot of very strange, very frustrating rejection letters for replications talking about things that replications should not be evaluated on things of novelty or contribution or what is the value, especially if this is stated in an editorial that they want to do more replications. So I have screen captures of my Twitter rants about all sorts of rejections from JSP and all sorts of unrealistic demands and expectations, very absurd negative experiences with them. Our replication rate is, 40%, something like 40 to 50% with them. And basically some of the things that we get from them is concerns about the original's method. So why did you have this flaw in the replications where it's very clear we just followed the original? Yeah, you published this before. You published that article whenever that took place, and they had whatever methods. We're just repeating what they've done. So you can't criticize us on just repeating what the others have done. We just want to see if we repeat this, do we get the same kind of things? Past research has showed this already. There's a large body of literature that has already shown that ego depletion or power posing or priming is solid. Therefore, what are you doing with this replication? We already know that this stuff works. And then contribution fit for JSP. You've invited replications where some of the very few teams that are submitting replications. So what are you talking about not contribution? And I think one of the very frustrating discussions, I actually gave a talk in Kent University where Roger is a member, and he attended. And after that, we had a Q&A, which was recorded. And Roger shared some of his in management. And because it's valid in social psychology, there are expectations for impact factor. And what can you do as an editor? Replications are not as sexy as other things. They don't get as much media attention and citations. And it was very surprising for me to hear this kind of thing coming from Roger. So if Roger feels that kind of pressure as an open science advocate and as a leader, I'm sure that all the others, and sometimes I get from reviewers, we've submitted many times to JSP and we didn't get our paper in because of contributions. So what do you think you deserve to come in with a replication that simply repeats what others have done before? Yeah, it's very it's very disappointing for me, and I don't have a good way of engaging with this that doesn't criticize the entire approach of what it means to be a high impact journal. If this is your high impact as Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, you really need to rethink, what does it mean to have impact? Do you emphasize trustworthiness, credibility, replicability, reproducibility, or you do emphasize how many altmetrics scores, how high the citation rate is? Do you want to have a solid literature, or do you want to just have a lot of people citing each other all the time? So I'm trying to make sense of all of this, but I also acknowledge, and this is how I reacted to what Roger and other editors say. I've never been an editor. I don't know what it means to lead this kind of journal. I don't know what kind of pressures they're under. I would like to think that I would do things differently, but I don't know. Simin Vazir, that was in SPPS as a lead journal, talked about some of the pressures that she has had in that journal, trying to implement open science policies, and now she's doing a lot better in Collabora, where she has a little bit more of an opportunity. But leading high impact journal has a lot of pressures for editors. So I don't know what they're going through. I just have to say, from a very limited perspective as an early career researcher trying to do these things, at the very least, what I'm asking for is, please be transparent about this. Please share what you're doing and whether you're following your own editorials. So one of the things that frustrates me about Journal of Experimental Social Psychology is that the reviews are not open. And when it's, when I want to cite from this, I need to reframe this, because I can't just take this as is and post this on Twitter. And I think there's just a lot of miscoordination between the editors. So one editor is doing, oh yeah, this is amazing, great replication work, and the other one is like, replication work is garbage. I don't think this matches with JSP. So they're not aligned. They're not aligned with the community, and they're not aligned with each other. So just as journals, we really need to revamp the whole thing about how decisions are being made as editors. Now, I'm gonna mention this project because this one was especially difficult for me. So this is by a group that I really appreciate. I would say this group is one of the reasons why I personally got into open science. I used to be in Maastricht University as a postdoc, and an hour away was Eindhoven, and I would go and I would sit in some of their workshops by Lakens before there was the course in Coursera, and I would learn a lot. I remember the first time I went over there, and Lakens went around the table asking people, so what do you think a p-value is? And I, honestly, up until that point, I didn't even think to contemplate too much what is a p-value. But then it was just like baffling, from students to full professors, that people don't know how to define p-value. And whenever they try to use their intuition to define a p-value, it seems like everybody just gets this wrong. And until now, I'm really struggling with this kind of thing. And even when I'm explaining this to students, I'm just baffled by my inability to conceptualize p-values, where our entire scientific system, the way that we decide on what gets published or not, is based on this elusive p-value 0.05 that somebody wrote in a notebook in the 1920s, and that kind of sustained up until now. So a lot of my open science journey has started my interaction with that team. I think some of them are really leaders, so showing me the way and how I think about open science and where we should be. So some people from the Tilburg University group now moved to the US. Definitely a lot of very, very prominent people. And you can also see Roger. So the editor of Journal of Experimental Social Psychology is on this preprint as well. The aim of this is deciding what to replicate, a decision model for replication study selection under resource and knowledge constraints. First glance at the title, love it. Why do I love it? Because if I have a limited time and limited money and limited resources, as human resources, I really want to know, what should I focus my resources on in order to progress the literature as fast as possible, assuming that we need replications, and we can so many things to replicate. Let's say 999 out of 1,000 have not been replicated. If you take the first slide that I showed you, whatever the number is, of these, which ones we should start from? So I like a model that tries to help a person like me decide what to aim for. So as you can see over here, we have a bunch. So they've tried to really model this with a bunch of variables, and you can see that it includes costs and uncertainty and replication value and the value coming undefined variables and the expected utility, and then where the replication fits in and what happens after the replication. Is there going to be less uncertainty? What is the expected utility for the entire literature? And finally, the most important, the expected utility gain that we need to compute of how much we're gaining from this. And I've had a discussion with this group. So Peder over here is very responsive and really willing to engage and learn, and approached me a few times to ask my opinion about this, and I really value this. So I have just respect and admiration for how Peder has done this whole project and everything that's been doing. What I want to discuss is how this project has been used so far in the rejection letters that we've been receiving for our replications. So every time we submit a replication, people are saying, but did you use the value estimation function? And why did you decide to replicate this when you should have tried to do other ones? And we don't know what the other ones are, but how can you really tell that this is valuable? Did you measure the uncertainty before replications? Did you measure the replication value? So my first points about this whole thing is this valuable? For sure. And we need to discuss this, and Peder really tried as much as possible to engage and have an open discussion about this. Now, if you think about this, we're trying to do this through replications, but as far as I know, and I've been following this kind of thing for a long time, and I've been searching for this, have we ever done anything about value for novel research? How do we know that novel research needs to be like really quantifying sort of things? We don't. So what is happening right now is now we're trying to define the value of replications, but we're not addressing novel research. So novel research, there we can go keep on as, but replications we need to address value. Question that we should think about: are replications really that different from novel research in terms of value? What does it mean, value, and why is it so special about replications that we need to address those? And I think this has to do with a certain bias that focuses on replications as if needing to justify value. And the problem is that rather than giving people a tool for what to emphasize and how to have maximum contribution to the literature, this tool is being used by reviewers or misunderstood as something as, this is how we're going to evaluate whether we should publish replications. And my main message is, we need to publish replications, period, because we just don't. So at the first stage, we really need to boost our replication rates before we start to prioritize. So anybody who's doing replications right now on whatever phenomenon is submitting this, I think holy work, really deserves the utmost respect, going against mainstream, putting resources, time, money into a direction that might backfire career-wise. This does not seem like a very wise move. So to evaluate them on a much stricter level than everybody who's doing novel research and mainstream just seems to me like something here needs to be acknowledged in the problematic use of this tool. So how can prioritizing scheme and defining value create bias? So here, for example, is how the goals are written in the article. We propose a formalized definition of replication value to guide the decision of which claims to select for replications when a choice between several candidates so let's say you're interested in 5 targets, and then you want to ask, of these 5 targets, which ones should I focus on? And it answers the question, which of those is the most worth replicating? However, how has this been used, even by some of the collaborators in this project? So Daniel Atkins and I have a back and forth sometimes on how I talk about replications. So I'm just very surprised on some of the reactions that I get, especially from somebody like Atkins or this team, saying, so what is your response to the comment that this was an odd choice to replicate just because it was already replicated extensively and we should mentioned this is conceptual replications. I know you didn't like our replications value paper. I loved it. I just don't like the use of it. But it seems that those reviewers are using that reasoning. And they're using that reasoning in order to reject a replication rather than value it. So it's been used in the opposite direction. So he gives an example. Take this paper, which we're now replicating. This is one of our peer community and registered reports. The mental accounting of sunk time costs. Why time is not like money. There is a ton of follow-up work. So did you establish whether the evidence base is solid enough or not? What does your single replication really add to this whole thing? And I was really sitting in front of the suite, like scratching my head, trying to understand, wow, if this is what this is the feedback that we're getting from the open science community, how can we even expect, reviewers and the more traditional mainstream folks to value replications? And honestly, I've looked at this extensively. I know sunk cost bias, and I've been looking at time and money effects. And I know that this replication is highly needed because of all sorts of things, which we actually mentioned in the preprint. But based on the value function of this preprint, for people, open science supportive people like Akins, this is not enough. And I have not done a good enough job explaining why I need replications, which for me is baffling because we just need replications for everything right now. So this is my summary of how I perceive this sort of thing, really shooting ourselves in the foot when we're using this preprint inappropriately. And my main message is we barely conduct any replications, and we can't seem to get replications published, definitely not in top journals. Our burning question is not how to prioritize replications, but the most urgent questions are, how do we really make replications mainstream? After a decade that we realize that we have a problem and we need to reform science, is really pushing replications forward in trying to get as many of them out there as possible. How do we balance replications and novel better? So not 2%, not 2.5%. It needs to be closer to perhaps what you perceive, 33%. I think the number should be even higher. How do we get more people to be involved in replications? How do we get more funding? Our lab with 120 replications has received zero funding from research, zero. Do you know where I get my money from? I get my money from the teaching folks. They love what I'm doing with the undergraduates, so they're giving me money for teaching, and I'm taking the teaching money and I'm putting this into research, but nobody is willing to. Every year I submit grant proposals about, we need to do this, nobody is willing to fund replications. Recently, the Dutch folks, a little bit in the UK, money here, money there. The Einstein last year, finally, the many babies gave them 100,000 euros. So, but the fact that open science, many labs, collaborations, psychological science accelerators can't get money to do big projects just baffles me. And then, of course, we need to really think how we get journals to publish replications, not how to make them criticize and devalue replications that are really needed, but rather exactly the opposite. So balance the playing field between the replications and non-novel better and get them to appreciate replications more. Novel research really has a clear systematic advantage over replications. This is something that we haven't really looked at. And when we try to separate replications from novel research and saying these are two different kinds of research. For replications, we have this criteria, but novel research, they can do whatever they want. We don't need to talk about value. It's too difficult to talk about value over there. We're creating an asymmetry. So the burning question, is it really how do we define replications value? Or rather, is it how do we define research value in general? And my response to this is a novel research that has never been replicated, but cited 5,000 times. Is it, so what does it mean? We've been publishing, doing TED Talks, books, whatever, on this thing that we did in the 1970s, but nobody has ever revisited this. Is this valuable? Can we really trust this? Can we do something with this? And we haven't really discussed these sort of things. How do we incorporate replications when we look at research value? And I think replications in general just add a lot more value. And we need to address all of these things together. So that preprint is terrific if the starting point was that all of our literature are registered reports. Everything is with open science data code and has independent replication. So in the same paper, they've done this in this lab or that lab. Unfortunately, what this preprint fails to capture is our very problematic current practices and the way that the entire system, the publication system, is biased and the challenges that we have. And I'll try and share a little bit of that. Wow, I'm really going beyond what I thought in terms of time, but hopefully we still have like 10, 15 minutes. So a lot of challenges. So for example, this preprint assumes that all the published articles are Lakens when he says this has been done many, many times. Why do you think this is valuable? You just assume that this is accurate, but I'm going to show you an example where we've tried to reproduce, not talking replications, we've tried to reproduce findings and we found errors, misalignment between the tables, the figures, and the text. We've ran this through stat check and we found errors. We don't know what's happening in this literature because nobody has been ever revisiting those. We assume that published research is real. For example, in priming, now we understand that it's not, and we're developing tools for fraud detection. So when somebody says a lot of publications on this, and really, how do you know? Like, have we ever looked at this? That it's unbiased. So now we know that there's a positivity bias for positive findings, no null findings, lots of questionable research practices. And if you have a lot of publications, let's say priming, which I'll talk about in a second, from a single lab, does it really mean that this is solid? But we need independent replications. So just the fact that something has been published many times by a single lab does not actually mean very much. And yeah, more of that. And the problem is, like, when we try to prioritize the use of money, so that preprint is trying to say, if you have a limited amount of money, then you should prioritize these kinds of replications. But generally, it's so difficult to reverse a finding, a novel finding that is published in a good journal by a good lab, a reputable lab. I don't know about good, a reputable lab. It can take hundreds of millions of dollars to reverse a false positive. And this is part of the problem of us not valuing replications enough. So I'm going to give some examples. Just baffled that in 2018, we still have a book by John Barge about priming effects being groundbreaking work of nonfiction, revealing the powers of the unconscious mind. And I'm reading this kind of thing. How in 2018, after he knows everything that's been happening since 2000 and let's say 12, 13, that he has the confidence to come out with a book like this saying, everything that I've published is just as is, trust me on this. And of course, cited a lot, people just enthusiastic about this. And I just want to give you an example. I was trying to see him present this book. So for example, this is a Google talk. You can go and look at the video. And I'm just taking this, like it's a random thing. I just paused in there. It's an hour and a half. I just looked at the middle and just looked at this one thing that he is presenting. Do you want to know how to turn a conservative into a liberal? It's very, very easy. You get them to think that they that they get a wish from a genie to get superhuman powers, and then suddenly they become liberal. So for example, over here, you can see no one has ever turned a conservative into a liberal. But if you get them to feel physically safe, then suddenly they shift their opinions. So we had them imagine that they were giving a superpower by a genie, about bullets bounced off of them. And after they've imagined this and we've asked them about their conservative views, suddenly it's amazing. They're much closer to liberals. So we've solved all the divide between conservatives and liberals by having them imagine that they're Superman. This is priming 2018. This is where we're at. So I understand psychological science 2010, for 2011, we've done things that we regret, but 2018. So I want to, of course, have a look at this paper. You think these are small effects? Just look at these effects. Democrats and Republicans, if you make them think that they're invulnerable, then suddenly look at this difference between like 6.5 and about 5. So fairly large effects. If you, I don't know how you evaluate things, but just like looking at the findings, where are the p-values at? Now we have p curve, z curve, we have all these kinds of things. How solid is this evidence? And 2018, we're still publishing things with this just below 0.05 kind of findings. And we go to Google and we talk about these as if they're solid. I found this once, given this sample. I'm not even doubting, I'm not even talking about it, did they do anything here or not? I don't even know. Like one of these people like Andrew is a collaborator. He's one of in our team. We do stuff together. I know he cares about open science, even does replications. So I don't know what was done in this, but to have the courage to publish a book and go to Google and tell them about this study as if this means that you can shift conservatives into being liberals by having them imagine that a genie gave them superpowers. I really thought that we're doing better right now in psychology, but turns out that we don't. How do I know that we're not doing very well? Because we have all these failed replications with priming. We just can't seem to get these priming, social priming things to replicate. And it goes from, recall, some, swirl and wire, unscrambling sentences. Now we understand we have all these problems. How can you really go? And these are some of them 2016, 2017, have the courage to say, based on one time that I found something in a specific context in a specific lab, now we have the means to shift mindsets from conservative to liberal. Ego depletion to me is like the most baffling. It was so heartbreaking for me to see this sort of thing, because we have a meta-analysis of a very large literature. You can see the number of citations with ego depletion. I really thought this is our strongest effect. Cohen's D above medium, 0.62. And the bottom line is 2 mass replication efforts, one with 36 labs, the other one with 23 labs, people who have studied ego depletion for decades. We have hundreds of citations, we have dozens of replications, people who are millions invested, hundreds of millions invested in all this. Just think about the amount of money getting into looking at ego depletion. And the second one is even by Kathleen Voss, who's one of the people who started this whole thing. So what is the effect size? It's 0.06 or 0.08 after we've had this massive 2 decades of literature on ego depletion. So what does it mean that we have tons of follow-up literature? To me, that doesn't mean anything until a registered report comes out with a lot of independent replications looking at the same phenomenon and having everything open, shared, best practices of open science. The fact that something is out there, I don't even know what to regard in social psychology and other literatures as well anymore. The need to reproduce null findings, I've tried to do this quickly. This is one of our replication efforts of a target by Heyman and Ariely in 2004. The nice thing about this is, like, I really like this article for a lot of different reasons, but it's very well cited. You can see over here, over 1,200 citations. So above and beyond the, let's say, threshold of 100 replications. And what you can see here, the curious thing about here is that, first of all, you have a lot of effects. So you have a lot of these kinds of things. And what you can see here is that for certain things, there is an effect. So for the money market, there is an effect. But the prediction is that there's going to be no effect for social market. Now, if you think about this, when we use null hypothesis significance testing, we can't really find support for a null hypothesis. So when I see something like this, a hypothesis that is basically a null hypothesis for no differences, I'm always a little bit skeptical about what does this mean? How did you measure this? And typically, what I can see is that because the p-value was above 0.05, they saw this as supportive of the null hypothesis, where, of course, this is not how null hypothesis significance testing is meant to be used, and it's not support for the null hypothesis. It's just failure to reject the null hypothesis. So if you really did a null hypothesis, you need to use other methods, which in 2004, they didn't have much of that for. And yeah, so we decided to look into this. There's a lot of story behind that whole thing. because of all sorts of other things that Dan Ariely was facing at the time. We did this replication, and we wanted to revisit this null hypothesis. If it's really a null hypothesis, we want to quantify this with a Bayesian analysis or equivalence test. But perhaps it could be that the reason why they failed to reject the null hypothesis is because they didn't have a well-powered sample. Perhaps if it was well-powered. So this is another problem with these p-values and the need to move for effect sizes. We can't really learn much from a failure to reject unless it's really everything pre-registered and well-powered samples and measurement is accurate and it's based on, so a lot of issues. Null hypothesis is very difficult to address with null hypothesis significance testing. And indeed, when we ran this, we had to reframe the null hypothesis that they had over there. So you can see the results that we have. So what they said is going to be a null hypothesis, we actually saw an effect. So if you see a null hypothesis in a published literature, typically it's going to be with another thing that's not a null hypothesis because the literature has a bias against null hypothesis. But if some of the things in the theory predict a null hypothesis, check and see how did they test the null hypothesis, and typically you'll see that they just got p-value above 0.05, and this means that we need to revisit this, and it's really valuable. It's very, very important that we now reframe the theory, not to say there are no effects, to say there are effects, but the effects are weaker. So really an interaction rather than a null hypothesis over here. So why would you revisit this? Samples used to be extremely underpowered. People misused null hypothesis significance testing. So replications allow us to visit theories that did things with null hypothesis significance testing, and for us to add value, either by seeing what happens with a well-powered sample, or by using equivalence testing or Bayesian statistics. And I'm not going to go into this, but this was rejected from psychological science. The thing that I want to say about this is that when we did the replications, we found errors in one of the studies, which later got an expression of concern by Dan Ariely and the psychological science editor. So replications are not just, if we run this again, can we get the same kind of results? But also, nobody has looked into this since 2004, aside from my students, and a bot that runs StatCheck and published this on PubPeer. So nobody has really done anything about this. And only because we submitted the replication to psychological science, they rejected us, Desk rejected us. But the editor said, oh, we have errors, so now we need to do an expression of concern if they can't solve this. And so replications are not only for seeing if something replicated, but also revisiting some of the things that are published. Okay, let's go beyond this. Unpublished finding, I'm going to wrap up with this last example. This is a paper by Gino, Moore, and Baserman, which I had personally cited in my own work from 2008. And the remarkable thing is this was a working paper. So this has never been published. But as you can see, as a community, we decided that this is important. I know that this is important because I've been citing this, and I know that I need this for both the morality and ethical behavior literature and for the outcome bias literature. So it brings those together, showing outcome bias for morality and ethical judgments. And you can see that as a society, as a community, we've cited this 151 times. And the interesting thing is that when I told authors, I want to replicate your unpublished findings, they didn't understand why I would want to do this kind of thing. And they said, we decided to give up on this manuscript because we got so many rejections on this. And actually, they were surprised that this gets any citations. They didn't even know that this was posted as a preprint. And when I told them that this was on SSRN, they said, maybe we should take this down. And for me, it's like, no, why would you take down something that 151 people have decided that they want to cite on this? And the amazing thing that Don Moore did is to share the rejection letters with me. And when I read those from 2010, all the way from, I think, 2004 to 2008, and these are like very big names. I don't know if you're familiar with judgment decision making, but Francesca Gino, Don Moore, Max Baserman, these people wrote the books on judgment decision making, and they couldn't get this paper published in OBHTP, JPSP, JDM, JAP, Management Science. Why? no theoretical gap addressing the theoretical contribution. This is not novel enough. They say, no, outcome bias is very well known. So what if you show this for ethical judgment? So I just copy pasted from the decision letters that they got. I'm like, oh my God, this is such an important finding. We now know that this is so valuable, but they got rejected for all sorts of things that we now know we shouldn't reject a paper based on that. So for example, collaborative psychology, Simin Vazir says, it's about the rigor, it's about the evidence. It's not about the theoretical, subjective theoretical gap based on a very biased literature. Anyway, we successfully replicated this. Hopefully we'll submit it to a journal. And the nice thing about this is that it does all sorts of things. Criteria has changed from 2004 till today. So now we understand that these are important, that we can overcome biases, and this is valuable. And it can give the work the respect that it deserves and bring back the focus to an important finding in the literature. So I really think if an unpublished finding as a preprint has received community attention, cited 150 times, we know that this is important. Replicate this and get that into the journal, and together as a community, we can get this back on track and correct the biased literature by which this was rejected. So that was a lot, I know, but gives you a teaser of some of the things that we've been going through and some of my thoughts. Very much work in process. My intuitions based on my work on this and some of the things that I've learned. I'm hoping that at some point I'm going to be able to put this into an opinion piece or perhaps a meta-scientific kind of manuscript. But it's very much open for you to give me your insights and to share what is it that you think about this kind of thing. I'm really hoping with Peter that we'll have a back and forth on this, and we'll come to kind of like an understanding of how we can use this preprint in order to boost replications, or how we can kind of level the play field with the novel versus the replications, and understand that we need both of them to work together in order to address this literature. So if you have any thoughts on this, if this is interesting to you and you want to work with me and our team on this, then I'm very happy to. This is stuff that I really care about, and I think this is at the heart, the core of how we evaluate science and how we think about science and what we should value in science and where we're going with the science reform movement and the open science direction. So even if people even in the open science community, like Clackens, can misinterpret or can use this in a way that I think is wrong. Can you imagine just what happens? So as a community, we need to talk about this more. We need to realign a little bit, and we need to have an open discussion that brings in a lot of opinions in order to see how we can progress everything and move forward. So if you want to talk to me, many ways to do this. Once again, this is my page about everything that we do in our project, the Mass Replications, including how to join us. Very active on Twitter. Our mailing list has a lot of updates about all the things that we've been doing, the talks, the media. So if you care about these things or you want to know more about the team, then you can subscribe here. If you want to talk to me more personal and you have some things that you need help in terms of both applications, publishing open science, doing pre-registrations, or anything about your open science journey, then please do contact me. Even if I don't have the time or the capacity to help you, we have these 78 early career researchers, so I can get you in touch with others, and we can get something for us to help you as a team, support you in your journey of open science and replications. So that's it for me for the talk. I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much, Gilad. That was a very, very interesting talk, and I think a very important talk. My impression is that in organizational behavior and management, there's not a lot of replications. There was a paper that came out in organizational behavior and human decision-making processes. I think a year ago, one of the authors was Simin Vazir, and they looked at the number of replications from 2011 to 2019, how much things had changed, and there was no change in the frequency of replications. But I do think things are changing, at least in other fields. My impression is that replications are becoming more common. So this is a discussion that we need to have. We need to think about replications. But so now we're just going to see what questions we have from the audience. We have one question, I think, in the chat. Let's see. Agatha, the question. Agatha says, thanks for a great talk. I was wondering if you could reflect on the actual meaning of replications. Does a successfully replicated effect mean or increases the probability that it is a true effect? So does a successfully replicated effect mean that it is a true effect? I'm very much for replications, but there's also an interesting discussion about the meaning of replications for science, with some modeling evidence for how many effects might just randomly not replicate, or they might replicate even though they're false positives.
Yes, terrific. I love this question for many reasons, because I think it brings in some nuances about the discussion regarding replications. So what is really a successful replication? So finding support for the previous findings in p-value lower than 0.05, or is it about the same kind of direction, or is it about overlapping confidence intervals with the effect? And how do we update our understanding? Let's say that we have a replication. How do we know that we did things correctly? How do we know that the first one was a false positive? Could be that things changed, the context changed. Could be that where there's a flaw somewhere. Could be that there's so many things that can go wrong with a replication. And I like the move, I think, even in the question, from a dichotomy of success, failed, this is true, this is false, to having a probability-based continuous scale of, before that, our prior was this. Now that we've had failed replication, perhaps we've moved this, and we need to assess to what extent we moved this in a certain direction. Not only if something is successful do we know that it's true, but if something failed, do we know that it updates us towards the this is not true. Of course, this depends on a lot of things. So how was the replication done? What is the sample size? Was this pre-registered? Was this a registered report? Was this the same lab? Was this an independent lab? Was this in the same culture? Was this in a different culture? So we need to have a lot more discussions about this. And I have to say that we don't have a lot of papers on this. We use the Lebel et al. Criteria from 2019 published in Meta Psychology about how to evaluate replications and how to update our knowledge. But generally, as a community, I don't think we've been doing a very good job at this. And instead of saying, does the replication really inform us something about the original? How do we know that replication did things right? I'm going to try and shift the question to, how do we know that the original did things right? Because in the replication, most of the time, pre-registered, open science, most of the stuff, registered report, I think meets the highest standards of what we know right now for what scientific rigor should look like. When it comes to the original findings, honestly, we just don't know, because the methods are just very, very brief. We don't have any open data. Of course, nothing was pre-registered. We know that this was part of a systematic, biased literature with all sorts of problems in it. So honestly, my default is regardless of replication versus original, I value registered reports, I value things with open science, and I tend to put more emphasis on that kind of evidence compared to a different kind of evidence. But we need to come as a community and say, this is the kind of evidence that we emphasize, and this is how we value that kind of evidence. Ego depletion is a really good example, because one of the frustrating things about this is we've published a lot of research on this, decades of research. And then 2 mass replication efforts of very specific studies came in and failed to find support, or very, very weak effects in support of ego depletion. But there are some, even the original authors, saying this is not conclusive evidence. We need to put more millions. We need to put more labs into it. We need to evaluate this more and more. And we need to come to a decision as a community. When do we stop doing replications? What is a reasonable amount of money to spend on doing a replication for something like power posing or ego depletion? And what is the role of the original authors? And when do we stop this? So all these are excellent questions that we have tackled as a community. And because we keep raising these questions and there are no answers to this, subjective opinions come into play. And whoever has the most power as a senior reputation, editor, journal, reviewer, they're the ones who get to tell us what is the evidence that is being emphasized. My general view is, regardless of replications versus original, I emphasize those that are supportive of open science. I do not take for granted that something has been shown if I can't look at the evidence. Right now, all of our published literature, let's say up until 2015, I have serious doubts over this. If anything, the replication is a tribute, a contribution, and value to helping the original authors and the literature gain reputation and credibility. Because right now, I don't know what we can trust, given priming, given ego depletion, given cancer biology, getting rates of 10% of stuff that's been published. We're not even talking about social psychology anymore. We're talking about life and death situation about cancer. So generally, I would like to shift the discussion from replications to how do we establish whether something is trustworthy. And if you look at Chris Chambers has this pyramid of evidence. Seriously, the best evidence I emphasize when I read something without open science, something that's been published, for me, this is anecdotal. Until I see a well-published, a well-powered, pre-registered, registered report of, then I have some confidence in this, which is why when I teach social psychology, I don't teach something unless I've personally done some replication on this, or I've seen some big group or mass collaboration that revisited this. Right now, I don't know what in our literature I can look at that hasn't had any replications and say, okay, I know this is trustworthy. How do you know? So we do need to model things. We do need to have a discussion on this. And we need to move from replications versus original to, from now on, scientific evidence. How do we evaluate this? And how does this update our knowledge every time that a paper comes up? Is it, big shift in our opinion? Is it a small shift? But right now, people give a lot of emphasis to what has been published before. Unless I really can see what has been done over there, just because it was published in some journal and somebody reported this, I think we need to revisit those. So this is the reason why we're systematically revisiting all of the classics in judgment and decision-making, and we really need to make this mainstream. I have a lot of ideas on how to do this, shifting from 100% novel research to replication and extension. First, you revisit what you've done before, then you add something to it with, tiny steps rather than big leaps. From now on, we have 0, and now we're going to have this new amazing theory based on my sample of 30. First, let's revisit what's been done, the foundations, and add incremental steps, and then we can build a solid literature. I hope that kind of addresses the general question, but we do need more people on this to have more discussions on this.
I'm new and I'm just a master's student, but I was wondering for maybe the reasons behind journals apparently not being very willing to publish replication studies, if that could have other reasons as well. For example, like them losing influence, if then the replications would have more meaning than being published in a highly ranked journal. Yeah, if that makes sense, I don't know, but what do you think about that? Could that be a reason for them kind of not wanting to publish?
Yeah, they have a host of issues of why they don't like replications. One of it is, of course, is that it's not new. It's somebody dedicating work, and for them, this is paper space. I don't know why we care about paper space in 2022, but paper space about how much to dedicate to a replication versus a counterintuitive, amazing finding that's going to change the world of psychology or science. So they want their journal to be referred to in that regard. So you get more media attention, you get more stakeholders to invest in this and care about this. And replications are generally not very sexy. They're not going to give you the kind of media attention, unless, of course, you went against a very big theory and you were able to bring solid evidence again. But seriously, it's a big bias. If even Roger in Journal of Experimental Social Psychology shares that this is something that he thinks about, then of course I can imagine that this has been on the minds of all the top tier journals, definitely the Science, Nature, PNAS, and all of those. They want to ensure value, and their perception is that novel, counterintuitive, big leaps are considered to be a bigger contribution. It's a big bias in that. Since you said something, I hope you don't mind me kind of building on one word that you said. You said, I'm just a master's student. I want to say, and this is very important to me, that to me, you are the hope of our science reform movement. I have very little hope with senior scholars. I have very little hope for people like me who have been brainwashed by the system. I grew up in a management department. Oh my God, the stuff that went on over there. People like you that come in and ask the right questions and keep an open mind and attend reproducibility and listen to this and keep up to date and try to make up their minds of not just why are people doing this, but how I can contribute and involve myself in fixing these kinds of things. You are the real hope. And I think our team has really shown that undergraduates as early as second year, master students, the early career researchers, they are the ones that are actually doing and pushing the science reform movement. They are the ones that are making the big change. Psychological Science Accelerator, the many labs, all of the big publications, PEDR with this preprint, all of the meta-scientific evidence and work that's been done. All of this is open science, early career researcher, enthusiastic scholars that are going to transform our field. And one of the reasons why I really try to discuss these things and make a change is because I want to empower people like you to not think of yourself as just as a master student, but really as somebody that can drive and make a difference here, because you haven't been brainwashed, you haven't lived in this system for long enough, and we, the little bit more senior, our main role is to find a way for you to survive in the system. Right now, the system is so rigged against open science folks. I try to little bit make more room for that, or within the current structure, find ways for someone from a master's degree, a master's student, to come in and survive in the system. So one of the reasons why we're doing this early career team is now we've shown that when we work together, we can do remarkable things, and we can publish even replications that are very difficult to publish. We can publish these things. When we come together and do these mass collaborations, we can get amazing manuscripts out. So asking more questions, participating in more journals, communicating what is it that you need, and the open questions are very important. I hope you don't mind, I just built on like the one word, because it's very important that you be involved and feel like what you say matters, regardless of what your rank is or what stage of your career. Your contribution is very much valued to me, to the same level or perhaps even more than somebody who has been in the system and published a lot of things in the old literature.
Can I ask you a question, Bevan?
Yes, please.
I find this really interesting. I want to just say, like, this is a comment first about the value thing, which I think is really important, right? To think about the value of both replications and novel research. One sort of issue is that you could then start asking what kind of research should we be doing at all, right? Should we be doing social psychology at all, or should we all research climate change or cancer or whatever, right? It is a subjective judgment, no matter how we turn it around. But my question for you is about incentives. Like, how do we change the incentives for early career researchers and more established researchers to do more applications and to get the money for it? Like, it's you're struggling with getting funding for this, and that says something for me about how the incentives are rigged against it, sort of.
Yeah, this is a painful thing for me, because I haven't figured it out. I redistribute teaching funding to research, and this is how I survive in this sort of thing. But I don't really have a good answers for this. But I do have like a suggestion, and I think this is part of the big revolution that's happening now. If you ask me, what is the biggest revolution in science at the moment, by far, above and beyond anything else, it's registered reports. Not only registered reports, but even more so the recent development in registered reports, which is registered reports 2.0, where you have peer community in registered reports moving away from the publishers and the big names into us as a community. We agree on giving in principle acceptance to something. Now, I have a lot of things to say about register report, but specifically about your point, how can this help resolve this sort of thing? So I'll tell you some of the very minor developments that I've had in my university. I couldn't get my university to fund me. Even with the teaching, it was like a very difficult thing. Finally, the last thing that I was able to push and convince, and I think the reason why they were enthusiastic about this, is that registered reports, what they mean is, if you submit a pre-registration plan after some back and forth with the reviewers, you get an in-principle acceptance from a journal of this being published before data collection. And it's much easier to convince the university, it's much easier to convince the funders, it's much easier to convince everybody that has resources once you have an in-principle acceptance. And then you dingle this in front of them and say, you want this publication? I need some money. Can you give me some money? And if the university doesn't give this to you, or the funders, you can go on things like, there used to be Study Swap, or you can go on Twitter like I do and say, I have this in-principle acceptance, who wants to be a co-author? And then you can have not just data collection, hopefully more than that, reviewing the manuscript as well, but much easier to get people on board and invest funding when you have this model of in-principle acceptance, and that this is going to be published regardless of what the outcome is. So a revolution for science overall, definitely a big boost for replications. And I created in the University of Hong Kong, I have a whole talk about that, what's called the Hong Kong University Register Report Challenge. It's a little bit like the pre-registration challenge that the Center of Open Science did in 2016, 17. This is how I got into pre-registrations. So we received $1,000 for just having a publication with a pre-registration. And they've driven an entire change in a community where suddenly people who have never done pre-registrations are now considering this sort of thing. So I said, I want to transform the culture at HKU, and it's a win-win for everybody, because instead of the university investing in things that might be a publication or not a publication, I told the decision makers, you're only going to fund things that are getting in principle acceptance. And because this is a replications and I conduct everything Amazon Mechanical Turk online and all of that, then minimal funding that for a fact are going to lead to a publication. And in this case, publish with undergraduate students. So once they got the understanding that at the beginning they were a bit confused, in principle acceptance, like what does that mean? And then you need to explain, yes, register reports are an amazing transformation of science. Even more than that, registered reports 2.0 offer you something remarkable, which is, I use this now, it allowed me to do everything, even as a thesis. They have scheduled track, where if you were worried that you can't do this as part of your master's or part of your undergraduate, you can now have schedules. So if you tell them 6 weeks in advance that you're going to submit something, you need to just do a snapshot. This is one page. They recruit the reviewers, and the reviewers are ready for you on a certain date, and they guarantee a review within 2 weeks. So suddenly you can do register reports. All the thesis can be register reports, which is remarkable. And once I have this in-principle acceptance, I was able to say to the university, we're publishing all the thesis with the students in reputable journals as part of the academic year. Now it's time for you to fund this. So this was a way to convince them. So I think this is really, really helpful for that. I think there are some sources, so for example, UK, the Dutch have now dedicated tracks for replications. Plus, the last thing that I want to say, and I mentioned this before, is that I know by now that if I tell people that I'm doing replications, they're going to say no. If I frame this differently, and I'm saying I'm doing replications and extensions, and then I'm adding things like COVID-19 pandemic related, because we care about pandemic, or I'm talking about climate change, global warming. So I'm able to get much, so suddenly it's like, oh, so he's not just doing replications, like he's updating this for something that we need right now to address the most urgent issues in our field. So moving away from just like replications, let's just see what works too. Replications and extensions updating to address what we all as a community need to care about. I love the comment about value. Last 2 years, I've also contemplated for a very long time, is what I'm doing valuable? Am I really putting the resources in what matters? For the first time in a very long time, pandemic decision makers came to us, psychologists, and said, so what do you have to contribute here? What should we do? How do we get vaccination rates or masks or social distancing? And what did we do? We just like shrugged and like we don't really know. So we also really need to think very carefully about how do we use all of these things that we know, let's say in judgment decision making, and how can we apply them to that? And we can do that with the model of replications and extensions, revisiting the old model and updating this to things that matter right now, so that we can come to decision makers and say, we have something, we've tested this rigorously, we know exactly what the effect size is and what the applications are, and now we're ready to move from the lab into a real test, and then doing all the structure of what it means to run this in the field. So register reports and the replication and extension model, updating this to stuff that matters right now, is some of the directions that I think have been helpful for us to get a little bit more of support and attention from the funders, from the university, and from the community. But I'm really hoping that some of the seniors will step up and do something about this. We really need a lot more funding. But I also think that we shouldn't wait for them. We should act regardless of funding, which is what our team is trying to do. And we should pool our resources. So perhaps your lab is small and my lab is small and we don't have a lot of funding. But if we work together, if we really coordinate, just like the physicists in CERN, we learn to, so perhaps every single lab doesn't have enough resources, but together we can come to some good scientifically rigorous conclusions that would be able to drive a change. And if we do this for long enough, definitely the last 5 years, we've seen that what early career researchers and how we've been doing psychological science accelerator are doing massive changes to how things are, at least in the social psychology bubble. Things are changing to the point that I think now in social psychology, I'm almost certain that there's no way back. I don't think there's something people are saying, no, we don't care about pre-registrations. We don't care about open data. I don't think that's going to happen in social psychology anymore. I think over there, we're just like on a track. We need to align organizational psychology, organizational behavior management. We need to align the economists. We need to align other fields. But at least I'm a lot more hopeful because I see these changes and amazing initiatives, Chris Chambers and the peer community folks, and driving single-handedly, early career researchers just driving this massive change to making me a lot more hopeful. And with that, perhaps in time, we'll also get a bit more funding for just core replication work.
But just a quick question from me, going back to registered reports, and when you talked about trying to replicate less well-known findings and unpublished findings, does that pose a challenge for registered reports? Does it become more difficult to sell the idea?
I hope not. I hope not. I think not. I'm a little bit hesitant to say something because by now we have 350, I think, journals that do register reports, and they all have their own agenda. I can speak a little bit more confidently about peer community in register reports. So right now we have about 15 in process. I think for 8 of them, 8 or 9, we already received decision letters. So I know how Chris Chambers and that team works. And I have to say, unbelievably enthusiastic about replications of all variety, some of the most constructive, positive reviews that I've ever received in all my academic career. So I think for peer community and registry reports, the people who are leading this, the nice thing is that all the recommenders, their editors, go through open science training, where they try to shift away from the inherent biases. So at least for peer community and registry report, I don't think this is really an issue. If anything, I think this would be valued. I think journals like Meta Psychology, the revolutionary open science journals, would definitely be very happy about this. So they have also policies about also Chris Chambers in Royal Society of Open Science saying, if this is a finding and it's been cited and it's like, no, we want to publish a replication regardless of where it was published, what it was. So you have meta psychology, RSOS, peer community and registry reports that would take you in. Probably you would not be as successful if you try to do the JSP, JPSP, OBHTP, definitely not. But maybe in 5 years, this would be different. But right now, if I am to decide to do this kind of thing, I would focus on the peer community and register reports initiative. And I don't know if I made that clear, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, but if you get an in-principle acceptance from peer community and register report, you, as the author, can choose one of 25 different journals to publish, because these journals have guaranteed that they will publish whatever the community gave an in-principle acceptance. So it's, when I say peer community and register reports, I don't mean just like one. It's not one journal. It's not one community. It's a host of journals. And I know that the number of journals that are supporting the peer community is rising. So if we have this revolution in place, and we have open science supportive recommenders like Chris Chambers and others in the community, then we don't need to worry as much. If they accept something, it means that a host of journals like Meta Psychology and others, Collabora Psychology perhaps, cares about this. They have also a subsection called interested journals. So for example, you worry about, I want to be very impactful, but I don't know if I can publish in the top tier journals based on this initiative. So for example, Nature Human Behavior is an interested journal for peer community. So if you get an in-principle acceptance, you can see if they're interested in this or not. But because of these revolutions that are happening now, this is when it's starting. I'm a lot more hopeful. And even if you have something that's unpublished, or you have something about reframing null hypothesis in classic literature, I think now it's much easier to get those in and have an impact, reignite, correct the literature, and just bring the community to pay a little bit more attention to that by publishing these replications or doing this kind of work.
Well, thank you so much, Gilad. Thank you for a fantastic talk. And thank you everyone else for joining us.
Thank you. Really, if there's something that you want to talk, please do get in touch. Happy to hear from you.
I might get in touch with you about a replication very soon.
Yeah, I've been waiting for you for a long time, but take your time, like no pressure. I would love for us to work together.
Definitely.
Okay, good. Hopefully see you in Oslo sometime.
Yeah, I hope so.
Okay, bye for now.
All right. Bye, everyone.